There were people who recognized that there was always a downside to industry when you're exploiting natural resources. The protest of the 1980s, when the Friends of Strathcona Park were concerned about a second mine going into the park, there was a completely different battle that raged on throughout the 50s, and it became known as the Battle for Buttle. It was instigated by Roderick Haig Brown and a few concerned friends, namely William Reed.
He was a public school boy from England, as I was, and when he came to Campbell River, they made him into a magistrate, and he was also a very, very skilled, very concerned environmentalist and fly fisherman. He lived right on the banks of the Campbell River.
What happened was that the Power Commission, and that was the name of the corporation that produced power in BC before BC Hydro came into being, had permission to build a road into where the park began. And the reason was that they wanted to put the third dam of a series of 3 dams in the water system at Buttle Lake. Now, what concerned Haig Brown and Reed was that they knew if you put a dam, the water levels are going to rise. So one thing that happens, and they had already seen this happen at Lower Campbell Lake, is that the water levels go up, and at Lower Campbell Lake, they hadn't taken all the trees down before it happened. So the trees ended up being a hazard for boaters especially. And they also saw a significant reduction in spawning areas for fish. So they knew by experience that this is what could happen in Buttle Lake. Buttle Lake was considered to be one of the most beautiful lakes ever seen by people like Haig Brown and Reed, and they really loved it there. The whole shoreline was beautiful old growth trees. To convince the people in charge that it wasn't a good idea to put this dam at Buttle Lake and that they should maybe consider Upper Campbell Lake. However, they lost initially, but then the whole thing kept active through papers and people continuing to lobby and say, no, this is wrong. What finally happened was when they did the testing by engineers at Buttle Lake, they discovered that it was too sandy and it wasn't exactly a good place for a dam because there would have been quite a bit of seepage. So one of the main things that came out of this, and that was the importance of it, was to show that when citizens were concerned, that they could step in and have a voice. And it's considered to be Canada's first environmental battle. In 1910, when the Ellison expedition went through, they said that Harry McClure wrote, in one evening, they caught 70 trout. That would never happen today. You might catch 2 or 3 in a day, but you'd never catch 70. It used to be such a fantastic fishing area. The variety of trout that used to exist in Buttle and Upper Campbell Lake, called Dolly Varden, that were gone and have never returned. And they realized the problem was from something called acid waste. So one person who was hired in 82, a Dr. Tom Peterson, came from UBC and tested the water. And he said, oh, this is what's happened. It's acid waste.
Acid rock drainage is a fundamental concept that's important at the mine at Myra. It's been known for a long time. It's probably been known from antiquity. lot of ore deposits were undoubtedly discovered because of acid rock drainage. So it's not something that doesn't occur naturally. It's a natural occurrence. The way that it works, it's kind of mineralogically dependent, and it's to do with the fact that minerals form in a certain environment and then they're exposed in another one. And the environment that a lot of sulfide minerals form in is anoxic. There's no oxygen around, there's mostly sulfur. And then they're exposed at the surface or close to the surface or even in groundwater to oxygen. Get them up to the surface and they oxidize. And when they oxidize, they break down and two things happen. They dissociate. The iron gets partially oxidized itself, and the sulfur gets oxidized. And when you oxidize sulfur, what happens is that you can actually, in the presence of water, create sulfuric acid. So meanwhile, this sulfuric acid has also dissolved other less soluble sulfide minerals, such as chalcopyrite or bornite and sphalerite. And those now have dissociated as well, and so you've got ions of zinc and copper that are also flowing in the groundwater, and those can come out.
Mining companies were not really aware of the kinds of impact that they were making on environments, and particularly when they were close to water. So even though some people had recognized that tailings were being dumped into the lake, this was just a common practice.
I remember very distinctly that at one time I was covering a lot of stuff about acid mine drainage. They were increasing the size of the tailings pond up at Myra Falls, and that was all draining down into Buttle Lake, which is at the top end of the drinking water supply system and the whole water supply system, basically, for Campbell River. So I was not impressed with that.
It was surprising to hear about this acid waste pollution, and took me back to the fact that the year before Tom Peterson had found out about it and reported on it, 1981, I was living at the lodge that year. Many of us were literally drinking lake water, and this water would have been used in cooking. This water was used, we swam in it, we paddled in it, we were in the water, quite frequently, especially during the nice weather. And anybody who came to the lodge and the school groups were all using the lake. And then many of the school groups would go into Buttle Lake. And people thought of those lakes as being pristine. And not only that, those lakes are part of the watershed. That's the drinking water for Campbell River. And again, yes, the water is treated, but it just suddenly hits you really strongly when you realize that you are living there and this is your source of water. And then I remember that over the years, Myrna has said that she always had a high metal count in her blood, and she had to get it. She was taking a naturopathic treatment for it called chelation, because she said she was never able to figure out why she had this high metal content in her blood. But then after I found that out and she found that out, it all came together for both of us. Well, I think that one of the biggest concerns with that not only was the drinking water, but it was the fish, because people were fishing there and eating the fish. So if the zinc levels were too high for human consumption, and as Clark said in his report, he said zinc is particularly harmful to salmonids, and that's what trout are. So not only did it kill the trout, but if people are eating that trout, that's dangerous as well.
By the time the whole thing with the Friends of Strathcona Park happened, I had already been with the newspaper for about 11 years.
Part of this began with Kenneth Kiernan, who was the Minister of Recreation, And he decided to set aside this part of the park so that Western Mines could establish their mine there. And at the same time, he changed some other classification areas. Most notably, he called one area recreation. So that sort of assumed that, oh, well, that was just set aside for recreation and nobody could have a logging concern or a mine or anything else in the park. But what it actually meant was that anything goes. So there was quite a bit of concern at that time, that was in the mid-60s, about him changing all these classifications around. So at that time, a company by the name of Cream Silver was also considering activating their claims that were very close to Western Mines' claims. But they didn't do anything right away. So by the mid-80s, had meetings about something they were calling the Wilderness Mosaic. And it was more or less same thing that had happened with Kiernan. They were reclassifying parts of the park, and they were taking chunks of the park off and giving them to timber companies, and all kinds of crazy things were happening. So Jim Boulding went to one of these meetings, and the thing that he came up with after that, he said, you cannot sell secondhand wilderness. Like, people were just really astonished about all of these crazy plans. And then he heard that Cream Silver wanted to activate its claims. So what happened was some of the people who were working at the lodge at the time, mainly Marlene and Steve Smith, and Rob Wood, who's a famous local mountaineer, were talking with Jim about all of this. They could see how upset he was, and they were upset. They didn't want to see a second mine go in because they were aware of the pollution that could happen from the mine, especially, destroying Buttle Lake. And Cream Lake, where Cream Silver wanted to go in, is absolutely outstanding. It's a beautiful, beautiful place and favored by many hikers and campers. They had a meeting with another friend, and the four of them created the Friends of Strathcona Park.